So for more insight on this day, we welcome to studio Ruth Wasserman Lande, the founder and CEO of the Ruth Global Innovative Advisory and a former Israeli deputy ambassador in the Israeli embassy in Cairo. Ruth, always a pleasure to have you here in studio. And of course, Egypt really is in your veins. You worked there for many, many years, although not at the time that this all unfolded. But take us back, if you will, your memories when we were looking at our screens and social media and watching all of this unfold.
So, first of all, about Egypt being in my veins, there's something amazing. There's a saying in Arabic, it's an Egyptian saying that if you drink from the water of the Nile, you always go back. And that's really true. If you don't die, you always go back. It's very true. One thing I can say that is very, very relevant, and that is nobody really predicted the Arab Spring, which is a very teaching statement to make, because that means that it can happen again at any moment, at any time. The economic situation in the Middle East, in a number of Arab countries, is terrible. The employment, or rather the unemployment of a lot of young people is terrible. Let's take Egypt as an example, a huge percentage of unemployment. And therefore, even though it all seems very stable, or rather even more stable now than it was before, and it did seem stable before as well, it can happen again, not only in Egypt, but in other places as well. It was like a match was lit in Tunisia, and suddenly the entire Middle East was up in flames. I can say that one thing that we need to very much look at, the young people in Egypt, if you ask them today, what would they like to do? Would they like to have freedom? Would they like to have liberty? Would they like to have freedom of expression? Let's say that they could speak very freely. Many of them would say, behind closed doors, that they would want to go to Dubai or to Abu Dhabi. Places that are not necessarily the implementation of what we know in the West as liberty and democracy, and yet there is a freedom there to live as one wants, whether you are Egyptian, whether you are Pakistani, wherever you're from. And the shifting of that dream is something perhaps to learn from, about the Egyptian mentality, the Egyptian psyche today, given the difficulties within.
As you say, when we think that it was 10 years ago, it really is quite astounding. How do you feel, from your perspective, the developments then helped to shape the way the Middle East is right now? Ever-changing, of course, as we've discussed here so many times, but really, what is the impact?
So there's a huge impact in terms of which factors, which role players gain strength in the entire region, let's say, not only the Middle East, and that is, of course, Iran, Turkey on the other hand. And in some strange way, that sort of brought the Sunni countries together, and perhaps even a little closer, more bravely closer to Israel in a sense. So that was one sort of repercussion that wasn't obvious. I think that the instability in the Arab world, for example, with what happened in Egypt, is very scary in terms of allowing those factors that are already inherently well organized, like formerly the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, they're outlawed right now again in Egypt, but in general, under the surface, the most organized factor, because civil society is not organized, it's extremely fragmented in most of these countries. Syria is in a very, very bad shape. Of course, the monarchies are a completely different story. But in Egypt, as an example, whenever instability boils, there is always a scare that the Muslim Brothers or the Islamists will come and surface again. And that, of course, is not an alternative for liberty, for freedom, and so on. So this play of power is something to watch out for, and 10 years have gone by. We always say the Arab Spring, the Arab winter is more like a term that would describe what has come, what has really happened with the Middle East in the last years.
And I want to ask you, Ruth, specifically as a woman who had worked in Cairo, we talk about freedoms and liberties and how the landscape has changed. Freedoms for women, specifically in Egypt and broadly speaking in the Middle East, how are things developing there? Your personal perspective.
So, okay, the 3 years that I spent in Cairo, perhaps less indicative for an Egyptian woman because I was a diplomat, a foreign diplomat. I always took care in terms of, you know, the dress and the respect for the local customs, and it is a very religious society. I think that President Sisi has taken several significant steps to really raise awareness to women empowerment. As strange as it sounds, first of all, there are women ministers in Egypt, the Minister of Tourism and other ministers. There are women ambassadors, not to mention other countries in the region. Of course, the situation is very far from being, let's say, rosy. But if I keep to Egypt, Iran even, places like that one would expect that there would be no freedom for women, and they're very different from one another. Yes, Egypt and Iran, I would say complete opposites. There are inherent freedoms that we should not take for granted, and yet a very, very long road to still take.
Well, it's great to hear there has been some level of progress, but I couldn't agree more. A long, long road ahead. Yes. Ruth Wasserman Lande, as always, a pleasure to hear your insights here in studio.